Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is empty. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear empty used is to mean to remove all the contents of a container. Okay. So with this particular definition, I think of something that happens in my household frequently. All the contents of the milk carton will be removed, right? People will use it. So it seems like we go through a lot of milk. So pretty common to even ask, wait, hey, who emptied the milk carton, right? Who used it all? A second way you might hear empty used is to mean to be vacated by people. So here, with this definition, think of kind of a place, maybe a building being filled with people, and then all of those people leaving, right? That is what the second definition means. A third way you might see empty used might occur in your geography books. So this third definition is very specific to rivers. And so it's when a river discharges or flows into a sea, an ocean, a lake, some other body of water. You should know that empty is a regular verb. To make the progressive tense, all we need to do is add ing to form emptying. But to make the past tense and participle forms of our verb, we're going to have a spelling change. And the reason for that is that our verb ends in a Y and we're adding a suffix that begins with ed. So here we need to change the Y to I before we add ed. Our base verb, empty, makes a vowel sound, and all vowel sounds are voiced, so our past tense ending is going to make a D sound. Emptied, emptied. Okay. Now, there are a few phrasal verbs that you might hear, and you're going to see that some of the meanings are pretty similar. The first you might hear is to empty in or empty into. And again, this could mean we're pouring the contents of one thing into another container, another object. An example of this might be, I emptied the leftovers into some Tupperware. Right? So imagine there's a pot on the stove, right? People have served themselves and there's still food in there. And you want to keep the food to eat the next day or the following days, right? So we're going to pour the contents from that pot into some Tupperware. Another way we can use empty into is to mean to drop or flow into something. So this really ties back to that third definition of the main verb we looked at moments ago. An example of this would be, the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico. Right? So here I'm talking about the longest river in the United States and the body of water into which it's flowing. The next phrasal verb we'll discuss is empty out. This can also have a couple meanings. One would be to remove all the contents of some space or maybe even a container. An example of this could be, she just emptied out her purse and found the missing key. Right? So maybe this has happened to you. Could be a purse, a bag. You're certain something is in there, but you have to take out or remove all the contents to find that one thing you're looking for. A second way to use empty out is just to mean to become empty. Again, because people have left. So this is like that second definition where we talked about people vacating or leaving. Here's an example. The arena emptied out quickly after the home team lost. Okay? So again, imagine many people crowded in to watch a particular sporting event. The home team loses, right? And so everybody leaves really quickly. They're probably upset. I want to go home. I don't want to think about this game any longer. Now, let's talk a little bit about active and passive voice. Our verb tense practice this week is going to be focused on comparing the two. Most of the time as I make these videos, I talk about active voices, active voice sentences. And those are the most common you're going to hear and see as you communicate in English. When we make active voice sentences, we always start with our subject. So the person or the thing that is responsible for doing the action that's in a sentence. I have a couple examples for us to look at. So I have Mike has cleaned the house. Jen has planted vegetables. In the first sentence, I know Mike is responsible for the action of cleaning. And in the second sentence, I know Jen is responsible for the action of planting. Now, sometimes you are going to see or hear sentences that are in the passive voice. So our sentences in the passive voice begin with the object, the person or the thing that receives the action or that is acted on. Okay? Sometimes the person who is responsible for the action, they won't even be mentioned in the sentence. Or if they are included, it's going to come at the end after the preposition by. So I can take my first two examples of active voice and change them into passive voice. So I could say, the house has been cleaned, period, right? Or I could say, the house has been cleaned by Mike. I could also say, vegetables have been planted, or vegetables have been planted by Jen. Okay? Those are our two passive voice sentences. And this usually leads people to ask, why do we have these different ways of forming sentences and communicating? And one reason some people will use the passive voice is they don't know to say who is responsible for doing the action. That's pretty common. A second reason is they don't find the person who's responsible for the action to be that important. They just don't think the subject is that important. But instead, they want the listeners or the readers to focus on that object, the person or thing being acted on. And so by beginning the sentence with that object, they're really emphasizing sort of that importance. The fourth reason some people will use the passive voice is they don't want to place blame on someone. So if this is a negative action, right? So cleaning has the tendency to sort of be positive, right? But we could think of other actions that might have sort of a negative connotation to it. And we don't want to say, you did this bad thing, right? We can just sort of note this bad thing was done. Okay? So today, let's practice and sort of compare active voice in the present perfect to passive voice present perfect. And again, all of our sentences are going to focus on the verb empty. So when I am making a present perfect sentence in the active voice, my structure is going to depend on the subject, right? So if my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'll use have. And if my subject is he, she, or it, I'll use has. Okay? And then after that, have or has, I'm using the participle form of the verb. Okay? Now, in the passive voice, my structure is going to be similar in that I start with have or has. It depends on if my object is singular or plural, right? And then my pattern is going to be to use the participle been, B-E-E-N, and then the participle form of the verb. Okay, so I've got two sentences here that have the same meaning, or trying to sort of share that same meaning. One in the active voice, one in the passive. Let's read them. Shoppers have emptied all the supermarkets. Right, so they've bought everything that's inside the supermarket. That's what that means. Or I could just say, supermarkets have been emptied. Sometimes this happens as a result of a natural disaster or some other sort of panicked buying moment. This happened a little bit at the start of the pandemic here in the United States. Not all items, select items were emptied, or select shelves were emptied, we might say, during that time. Okay, so again, same idea. Both of these sentences are trying to convey. Sometimes you'll see passive voice even in headlines to be a little shorter or more succinct. Okay, now if I want to make negative present perfect sentences in the active voice, my pattern is going to be to start with the subject, then use have or has, then then not, and then the participle form of the verb. You might hear the contraction haven't or hasn't used as well. But in the passive voice, again, I'll start with have or has, depending on if my object is singular or plural. Then I'm going to use the participle, goodness, I keep forgetting my nots. That's important. So we're going to do have or has, then not. And again, we can use those same contractions, haven't or hasn't. Then been, and then the participle form of the verb. Okay, let's look at our two examples. He hasn't emptied the trash can in weeks. Okay, or again, maybe this is one of those instances where I don't want to blame and say he is responsible. And instead I might say the trash can hasn't been emptied in weeks. Okay. Lastly, let's look at making some yes or no questions. To do this, in the active voice, we start with have or has, whichever form matches our subject, and the subject comes next, then that participle form the verb. Here's the example. Have hackers emptied people's bank accounts? Okay? So this idea of stealing, right? Taking everything out of others' bank accounts. Now, to make a yes or no question in the passive voice, again, I'll start with have or has, whichever form matches the object. The object comes next. Then we have the participle been, then the participle of our verb. So I could also just say, have their bank accounts been emptied? Okay? Maybe it's already sort of understood who's responsible. Perhaps we're having a conversation about certain hackers and what they have done or tried to steal as a result of their actions. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb empty. And the first word we're going to discuss is the adjective form of this word. So, same spelling, same pronunciation. The adjective empty can have a few different meanings. One is just to note that something is not filled or not occupied. So an example of this might be, the waiting room is empty, right? There are no people in the waiting room. A second way we can use the adjective empty is to suggest that someone or something lacks meaning or lacks sincerity, like a true, honest feeling. So an example of that. That was an empty apology. Right? Maybe this has happened to you where someone says, I'm sorry. Right? It doesn't sound like they mean it, right? When they say it that way or maybe make those facial expressions. So that apology lacked meaning. It lacked sincerity. A third way we can use the adjective empty is to say that something has no value or has no purpose. An example of this. Some people's lives felt empty during pandemic lockdowns. Okay, and this is a really sad sentence for me to write as an example, but I thought it might be something that helped you understand. Perhaps you had friends or other loved ones that really struggled with being isolated, being alone. Many people lost their jobs, right, during that period, and they could feel like, what is my purpose, right? And I would say everybody has a purpose, right? But it's easy for me to say, don't feel that way. Sometimes circumstances do make us feel that way. The next word we're going to look at is the noun form of the same word. So again, same spelling, same pronunciation. When the word empty is used as a noun, it's used pretty informally. Many times we consider this to be slang for a container that doesn't have any contents. And I'll tell you more commonly, I've heard it used to refer to cans and bottles, particularly as they relate to alcoholic beverages. So an example of this: there were so many empties scattered on the living room floor. So this is just going to mean empty bottles and cans, most likely. The last word we'll look at today is the noun emptiness. This can have a couple different meanings. One would be the state of containing nothing. Here's an example of that. The emptiness of the building drew the photographer to this location, right? So sometimes you'll see really interesting photographs. Could be stores, homes, things that have been left with sort of nothing inside them. That's what this sentence is describing. A second way we can use that noun, emptiness, is to refer to the quality of lacking meaning or lacking sincerity. An example of this might be, there is an emptiness to their statements after so many broken promises. So we can imagine a person who has said, I'm going to do this, I promise I'll do that, right? But they keep breaking those promises. They don't follow through with what they have promised. So as they continue to talk, right, you think, they're not going to follow through, right? I don't believe what they're saying. So we can say those statements have a bit of emptiness to them. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.